Can you explain the Blake Snyder beat sheet?
Sure. So Blake came up with this idea of, sort of the 15 beats that make up any story. He put them on a beat sheet. It's become famous now it's a great tool for people who are developing a story idea, I think, or trying to learn about story structure. So I will say the one thing that I think people who are introduced to the beat sheet maybe overlook and then have to learn later, so this is a shortcut, is that some of the beats are turning points and then some of the beats are sections of the story. So I'll go over them, but it's useful to note that because I think that's one of the things that confuses people when they're trying to learn about the 15 beats. Okay, so the opening image is sort of the first image of your screenplay or of your movie. It sets the tone, kind of establishes when and where we are in the world, right? So the world of your story. The next beat that shows up on the beat sheet is the theme stated. And Blake wrote in Save the Cat, I think that theme stated shows up on page 5 of your screenplay. It's, the theme is usually that sort of like guiding principle or the big idea of the story, what it's really about kind of behind the plot and behind the characters, right? And he liked to say that it was stated somewhere in the story or, on page 5 of your screenplay, it was stated outright, usually in a line of dialogue by one of the characters. The next beat on the beat sheet is the setup, and that's one of those beats to pay attention to because the setup is actually a section of the screenplay, right? So it's not just one page or one scene, it's a whole section. I think he notes that the setup is like page 1 to page 12 or so. And so that's introducing us to the main character and their ordinary world or their normal world, sort of where they are in their life right now, before the story gets started, right? And one of the things he wrote about in Save the Cat was that you can kind of use the idea of at home, at work, and at play to introduce your protagonist. So seeing them in these different sort of aspects of their normal world gives us a sense of who they are. The next beat on the beat sheet is the catalyst, and that is a beat that should be more of a turning point, like one scene or one moment in your screenplay. The catalyst is also something that other people refer to as the inciting incident. It's really the event that kicks the story into motion. Sometimes you can think of it as the why now of the story. It's this event sort of, throws your protagonist's world into disarray or forces them into action by creating some sort of problem or opportunity for them that they have to take advantage of, that they have to deal with, right? And that's how it starts the story into motion. The next beat is the debate section. And again, it's a section of the screenplay, so this isn't just one scene. I keep emphasizing that because I've seen writers get confused, and when they're trying to outline their stories, they get to like the debate section and they put in one scene, and then when they go to write the screenplay, they don't have enough story to sort of fill out the pages, right? So the debate section is that section in between the catalyst or the inciting incident sort of kicking the story into motion and your protagonist deciding what to do about it. So there's that debate section in between there where we really try to sort of close all of the obvious doors for your protagonist and funnel them toward this main thing that they're going to do over the course of the story, right? I also like to look at the debate section as getting the audience on board. So you kind of tell us what's at stake for the protagonist, why they have to do this thing. Because usually the thing that they're going to do in Act 2 is this big, audacious, crazy, scary, dangerous thing, right? So the debate section, use that to get the audience on board and show us why do they need to do this thing? Why is it so important? What happens if they don't do it? Help us understand what the potential consequences are so that we have that tension of like wanting them to do it but being a little bit worried about them, right? Before they go into Act 2. So the next beat is the break into Act 2. So at the end of the debate section, after you've gone through all of that, gotten the audience on board, shown us why the character has to do this thing, the break into Act 2 is the turn in your plot where you send the protagonist into Act 2 onto that main adventure, pursuing that story goal, engaging in the main conflict, however you want to look at it. That's what the break into Act 2 does. The next section is the B story. The next beat is the B story. So Blake liked to say that, sort of after that main or that that major plot point of the break into Act 2, it was a good time to give your protagonist and your audience a little bit of a breather and introduce a subplot. He talked about the B story being sort of the relationship or the subplot where your character could discuss learning the theme. So a lot of times it'll be, it might be a romance or it might be a friendship or something, but it's giving your character an opportunity to talk about what he's learning, talk about what he's going through and what he's learning from it. The next beat on the beat sheet is fun and games. And again, this is a section of the story. So the fun and games is actually on the beat sheet. It's all of the first half of Act 2, right? So it's basically everything after the break into 2 up until the midpoint, which we'll get to in a sec. But so the fun and games, Blake wrote that is where we see the promise of the premise. So whatever the concept is of your story, the thing that's hooky and intriguing about this story, that's where we see it sort of come to fruition is in the fun and games. So I think his famous examples are Liar, Liar. It's where we see Jim Carrey getting used to not being able to tell a lie. Or in Legally Blonde, it's where we see Elle getting acclimated to Harvard Law, and she's very much a fish out of water. So that's fun and game stuff. You can also think of it as trailer moments, right? Those very entertaining and very sort of on concept moments or scenes that you would probably cut into a trailer to show somebody what's so entertaining about your movie. The next beat is the midpoint. So that's, the middle of your story. The midpoint is a more of a moment or a scene instead of a section. So again, just making that distinction. But the midpoint can be a few scenes in a row, right? It's not really a section of your screenplay, but it can be a sequence because usually it's a big set piece or like an action sequence or something that is a little bit bigger than other scenes, right? And really the function of the midpoint is to increase the opposition and or raise the stakes of your story. So basically what it comes down to is the midpoint is increasing the tension in your story to sort of give it more momentum to get through the second half, right? So sometimes it turns the story in an entirely new direction, but doesn't always have to. In any case, what it does is it increases sort of that tension feeling so that it's sort of like, winding up a toy and letting it go. So it gives us that extra momentum and energy to get through the second half of the story. Then after the midpoint, the next beat on the beat sheet is the bad guys close in. So Blake liked to say that this is sort of where things really start going wrong for your protagonist, right? So you can have both external and internal bad guys. So it can be plot stuff is going wrong. The literal bad guys can be closing in, getting closer, gaining on your protagonist. But it can also be emotional stuff. They're really struggling with what they're doing. They feel like they can't succeed, and maybe they're having a crisis of faith or of confidence. And then you can also have conflict within the protagonist team. So that's also causing things to fall apart, right? And basically, the bad guys close in section is leading us sort of downhill towards the next couple of beats, which are the All Is Lost and Dark Night of the Soul beats. And these are separate beats on the beat sheet, but I sort of like to talk about them together because they really are complementary and they work together to kind of create that low point at the end of Act 2. So I sort of like to think of them as one is more external or plot focused and one is more internal or character focused. The All Is Lost is usually sort of what I think of as the plot focused one, right? Where it looks like the protagonist is not going to succeed. You might think of it as he's, as far away from his goal as he'll ever be, or he feels like he's failing. He feels like there's no hope. He doesn't know how he's going to keep going on and try to get that goal. And then the Dark Night of the Soul is sort of the emotional reaction to that. Other things that can happen at the All Is Lost can be like the death of a mentor. I think this is where Blake wrote that there's like that whiff of death, right? So it can be the loss or death of a mentor or of a friend or of a support system. It can be a major setback like, being exposed to the bad guy. So now they know who they're up against, or it can be like losing an advantage, you know, but you want it to be pretty big because we're talking about kind of the big turning points of the story. And then the dark night of the soul is the emotional reaction to that, right? So it's now that this big setback has happened, or it looks like I'm not going to be able to achieve my goal, the protagonist sort of sitting in that for a moment and wondering, what do I do from here? And a lot of times that's where they have kind of a glimmer of, I finally understand the lesson of the theme. I finally understand what I should be learning from this experience. They're not always ready to embrace that lesson at that point yet, right? But they're starting to understand, like, oh, this is what all of this has been trying to teach me. And then after that, the next beat is the break into Act 3. So that's the major turning point where we go from Act 2 to Act 3. And basically, it's the beginning of the resolution section of the story, right? So that turn, you usually want it to feel like it's sort of pushing us in a new direction that is toward however the story is going to resolve, right? So your character, your protagonist might have a new plan. So after that dark night of the soul moment, they might have a moment of inspiration where they're like, oh, okay, now I know what I need to do. Now I know how to defeat this bad guy. And so the break into 3 is where they begin that final push to resolve that story, right? That main conflict, or you know, however you want to think about that story. So the next beat on the beat sheet after the break into Act 3 is the finale. And this is the section that most people forget is a section of the story instead of one scene, right? So your finale, or the way Blake wrote about the finale, is that the finale was all of Act 3. So it's what you would call the resolution, right? Or he called it the finale. So this is where we see that new plan that your protagonist has play out, or we see them execute that final push toward trying to resolve the main conflict. So finale, all of Act 3. I think is that beat 14, and then there's 15 is the final image? Okay. So the last beat on the beat sheet is the final image. So that's after the finale has played out. We've seen how the main conflict has resolved. We've seen if the protagonist has, you know, achieved his goal, if they've succeeded or failed, how the story ends, basically, like what is the final outcome. And then we have the very last beat, which is the final image, which sort of is that, you know, you might think of it as like almost the aftermath of the finale. It's now that the story is over, give us one kind of final scene or image or moment to kind of send the audience out feeling how you want them to feel. Knowing maybe what the character is going to do next, or you know, if you need to sort of recalibrate the emotion at the end of your story, maybe the end of the finale was a big action sequence, and you want to leave us feeling like knowing that your protagonist is okay and he won and he's safe and he's, you know, rested and not injured anymore, something like that. The final image can do that. Blake also liked to write that it was the final image is like a bookend for the opening image, right? So, you know, I think some people look at it as you want the change or the contrast between the opening image and the final image to be big enough to sort of show that there was a transformation in that story, right? So we went from point A to point Z, and there's a big enough contrast there that we can see this story, you know, covered some ground and had some consequence to it, if that makes sense.